Some physicists are worse, maybe much worse, than typical murderers in terms of damage done. That might sound like a crazy claim, but let's try to make the case and see what can be learned along the way. Murder is a form of destruction. Tragically, it destroys human life. But not all destruction is bad. For example, an old collapsing building is lawfully destroyed to make way for a new house. No one would say that anything bad has occurred. For destruction to be bad, it has to destroy something of value. If, now, instead of an old building, a priceless statue or painting is destroyed, then he would say that is bad, since that statue or painting has value, at least to someone. So in saying that murder is very bad, we must mean that a murder destroys something very valuable, that being human life. And anyone who unjustly and intentionally destroys the valuable we consider to be bad. But now let's play devil's advocate. Why and how is human life valuable? It's easy to say it's common sense, but as they say, common sense is not that common. Consider the fact, for example, that throughout history, hundreds of millions, if not a billion or more, men, women, and children have been brutally slaughtered in or in connection with war. For most of history and in many parts of the world today, it would be nothing to send thousands of young people to get their heads chopped or blown off in order to increase the backyard of some ruler by a little bit. And even aside from war, it's said that every 40 seconds, someone takes their own life, and millions of others try to do so unsuccessfully. And probably hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, even if they trudge on day to day till old age, find minimal, real value in their life. Life, for so many of us, feels empty and pointless. Those are some heavy facts. Does it follow from them that human life, in fact, has no value? And that a murderer, therefore, does nothing wrong in destroying human life, if nothing valuable is destroyed? No more than it follows from the fact that most people don't have much money, that money has no value. Money has value, but money has to be earned or otherwise acquired for someone to have it. Likewise, human life has value, but that value has to be earned or otherwise acquired for anyone to subjectively experience it. The value of human life needs to be realized. It needs to be lived into, matured into, grown into. And if that doesn't happen for a given person, then that given person won't experience, again subjectively, the value of their life, which will then remain only potential for them. Now, what is necessary for the value of human life to ever be realized and experienced by any given person? Obviously, there's all kinds of necessities: oxygen, food, sleep, and so on. But even with all that, and with all the creature comforts in the world, that value can never be for a given person found. If he or she has a worldview where finding it is impossible, if we think something is impossible, we won't even try it. For instance, if you find someone jumping over and over again, and they tell you they're trying to make it to the moon, you know that unless they're kidding or otherwise messing with you, they're crazy, since jumping to the moon is impossible. But even if something is in fact possible, if I think it's impossible, I won't attempt it either. It might be possible to find a better job than the one that I now have, but if I think it's impossible, I won't bother. It might be possible to get in shape and drop a couple pounds or more, but if I think it's not possible, I'll never get started. In just the same way, to ever attempt to realize the value of my life, I need to think that it's possible. If in my worldview it's impossible, then unless I'm crazy, I won't even try it. So what kind of worldview is needed to make it a possibility? In general terms, it's a worldview where values like truth, goodness, beauty, love, sacrifice, freedom, individuality, at least have real fundamental existence, and preferably have more existence than lots of other less consequential stuff. Admittedly, even if I have a worldview with all of this, there's no guarantee that I will realize these realities in my life. But there is then at least a chance. It is at least possible that with time and effort, I will mature into living a life that, instead of feeling empty, worthless, and hopeless, in other words, which is without value for me, is full of value. With that said, what kind of worldview then? makes living a valuable life impossible. One where values have no reality, or at least no objective and fundamental reality, and are at most subjective secondary side effects of something else. Someone with this worldview is essentially guaranteed to live a life that feels empty, worthless, and valueless, since anything that can make it otherwise does not for this person exist. Once more, something can exist in reality, but if I don't know about it, it won't help me. There might be a chest full of gold right in my backyard, but if I don't know that it exists, I can still be dirt poor. Likewise, values can have objective reality, and the possibility of maturing into a value-filled life can be absolutely real. But if I don't know that because I have the wrong worldview, they don't exist to me, and I will not so much as attempt to mature into that life. Now, what kind of, specifically speaking, worldviews are those that preclude the possibility of realizing true value in human life? There's plenty of niche ones, all kinds of so-called nihilisms, pessimisms, fatalisms, sterile monisms. In fact, every kind of cookie, idiosyncratic concoction that anyone comes up with as an expression and justification of their inner inadequacy is one such worldview. However, in the past few centuries, perhaps only one such worldview has become the most famous, the most widespread, and the most universal. In fact, it is now so pervasive that most of us don't even realize it's a worldview at all. We just take it for granted as the background of all our experience. It can be called by different names, such as naturalism, physicalism, materialism, but the main thing is its substance, which is, to put it simply, something along the lines of that what really truly exists is stuff or matter, and that anything and anyone else that might exist only exists as a kind of side effect of this stuff. What is this stuff? No one can say for sure, but it has something to do with the fact that we encounter tangible resistance when we try to move our bodies, such as when we walk up to a wall or try to squeeze a stone, and visually see different objects extended in space. From this fact, the move is made to come up with a general concept, usually called matter, which is then, in this worldview, elevated to the position of primary prestige and importance. That then has been the typical starting point of a field called physics, and of those who study it, called physicists. At this point, it's key to understand a major difference. It's one thing to study some of the elements of our experience, such as the trajectories of projectiles, how quickly things move, how mass and acceleration relate to each other, how heat, electricity, and magnetism work, and so on. This can be done for personal interest and or for practical benefit. For example, by studying how much weight different materials can bear without collapsing, bridges can be built. By studying how much force is needed to escape Earth's gravitation, rockets can be sent into space. By describing certain electromagnetic, as they're called, phenomena with equations, anything from cell phones, GPS, Wi-Fi, and other wireless communications become possible. Well, this is great, or can be great, depending on how these inventions are used. If this was all that physics was for most physicists, there would not necessarily be any problems. So what is the problem? The problem is something like taking these limited studies, which certainly have their place, and absolutizing them. This is what turns physics from an at worst interesting, innocent pursuit, and at best something tremendously practically useful and insightful, into something potentially deadly to all higher human hopes and aspirations. To understand what is meant, let's take an analogy. Consider how a painting works. First of all, a painter has in mind some theme or topic, generally speaking. Maybe he or she wants to paint a portrait, such as the Mona Lisa, or a landscape or a battle scene or otherwise. Next, a palette of different paint is used to make the idea in mind visible, to portray it so that other people can be led to think of the same idea or ideas. Obviously, however, the paints and the colors themselves are not the idea and can never be. If skillfully arranged, they stand for the idea, but they are not themselves it. With that said, since the paints and colors are needed for the painting, Studying and understanding them is, of course, important. In fact, there are fields like color science that try to do just that. But now imagine if someone who was an expert in paints and colors came along and declared that rather than paints and colors being used as means to express ideas, themes, topics, they, in fact, come first in the order of business. First of all, it's about the paints and colors. And if there happen to be any ideas, themes, topics indicated by them, then that's just a side effect. The real way to understand the painting is by studying the colors and paints more and more closely. Someone who wants to, for example, understand the Mona Lisa shouldn't bother about who the lady was, why she was painted, what her mood was, and so on, but should simply study the paint more and more closely and analyze the chemicals of the colors and so on. It should be perfectly clear how, with this attitude, the art of painting would be a goner. If the means are mistaken for the end, the whole existential order is thus inverted, and the creation and proper interpretation of painting would be over with. Hopefully, the analogy should now be obvious. What physics, when it is successful, studies is like the paint, the colors, and the canvas concerning a painting. Well, what the world and life really is like the subject of the painting. What the Mona Lisa is can never be identified just by looking at it more and more closely, analyzing the chemical composition of the colors, etc. And what life in the world really is can, as well, never be found merely by studying the phenomena which express them more and more closely. Life, the world, reality is truth, goodness, beauty, love, charity, relationship, freedom, individuality, personality, sacrifice, redemption, union, growth, hope, aspiration. Just like the Mona Lisa is a portrait of a certain lady by a certain artist. And none of that can ever, on principle, be found by trying to break apart particles in tunnels underneath Europe, by playing with mathematical equations, by measuring speed and mass, or anything at all like that. Now, to be fair, there are absolutely physicists who understand that, and who will be the first to say that what they study, while very important and interesting, is secondary and does not touch upon real reality, upon the substance of life. And against those physicists, there's no necessary objections whatsoever. But knowing one's place is a rare trait, and the usual tendency for all of us is to make one's particular little world an area of study, the be-all, end-all. The mathematician might want math to be the final key to reality. The psychologist might think everything is psychological. The biologist, biological. The poet, poetical. The business person might see money everywhere. The politician might think only in terms of power and politics, and so on. If my particular pursuit is just a part of the whole in competition with other such parts, then my power and superiority is limited. Likewise, those who dedicate their life to studying the appearances of life, of reality, meaning physicists, have the understandable, very strong temptation to make themselves the final bosses. If space, mass, motion, energy, particles, and so on are not simply the paint with which the picture of life in reality is painted, but is ultimate reality itself, then I, or at least others more advanced than me, are actually the final bosses, the high priests of ultimate reality. All that other stuff, philosophical, wishy-washy poetry like values, freedom, individuality, and anything else that was mentioned, might be nice, but it's not really reality. At most, it's a side effect of reality, or at most, something emergent and accidental. Real reality is what I study. I am the final boss of reality, ahead of and superior to all others. My field will, in time, have all the answers. Will know the ultimate why of things, such as when the theory of everything is uncovered or the ultimate differential equation is derived. Again, certainly not all, but perhaps too many physicists feel this way. The temptation especially for those of us who are not always necessarily the most emotionally and psychologically worked out. To make ourselves the final bosses of reality is just too great to pass up. Now, to not overstate the case, it cannot be denied that human nature and emotions will spring up anywhere they are not actively put down. Someone can be in an insane, destructive cult or have the most outlandish beliefs and yet still experience affection for their children, be able to bond with others, enjoy music, nature, art, feel awe, gratitude, curiosity, and so on. So the argument is obviously not that espoused materialism or something like it makes these emotions impossible. Someone can spend their days preaching that humans are just clumps of matter and yet go home and feel warm feelings for their spouse and children, experience the excitement of ambition and making progress in their career, even feel deep feelings of awe and reverence when looking up at the stars, and so on. The point is rather that such basic nature and emotions are nowhere near enough to produce the value and goodness that a human being needs in order to feel that life is truly worthwhile and valuable. And it is that value and goodness which requires effort and aspiration. It is not simply there, as are the basic emotions and instincts, that can never come about in a fundamentally erroneous context, which is essentially out of touch with reality. Just like someone who is convinced from birth that there's no such thing as money will never go out there and try to become a millionaire, someone convinced from birth that physics describes reality, that a physicist is any sort of authority whatsoever on anything other than rules and regularities pertaining to appearances, that stuff is all that there truly and actually is, will never take so much as a single intentional, non-accidental step to make something of themselves as a human being. When the fertile soil of human potentiality is paved over with the concrete of physicalism and materialism, it is almost a miracle if every so often a seed of human potential falls through the cracks and sprouts here and there. It is then the exception, not the rule. But to be fair, it is, of course, not just materialistic physicalism, which is deadly for inner human life. Innumerable philosophies and worldviews, dead and sterile at best, and patently ludicrous and deceptive at worst. All, if put on poor, unsuspecting youth, can ruin chances of ever working out a life which is worth the while. It is just that materialistic physicalism, or the bread and butter of many, but not all, physicists over the past few centuries in many parts of the world has become the single most widespread, unconsciously held philosophy, and thus deserves special note and condemnation. And that would be the argument for why a certain kind of physicist, emphasis on certain kind, or anyone else that, be it innocently and unintentionally, from their own blindness to what is real and meaningful in life, preaches a worldview where nothing of true value has any existence at all, quite likely is worse than a murderer. Because a murderer can only harm bodies and is usually and hopefully stopped after at most a handful of crimes, while these kinds of physicists, through the propagation of a worldview where appearances, where the paint in which life is painted, is made out to be ultimate and primary, are absolutely deadly for untold quantities of people, not just for bodies, but for minds, selves, and any possibilities of healthy and full human individuality. But ultimately, blaming and pointing fingers only goes so far. What's preferable is a positive approach. Each and every person is sorely in need of a positive philosophy of life that gets enough things right, that makes it clear that the value of life is to be realized in each individual life, and that nothing that can be seen or touched can compare in reality with some of the aforementioned, such as goodness, beauty, love, duty, righteousness, relationship, freedom, individuality, personality, sacrifice, redemption, union, growth, hope, aspiration. It teaches that ultimately the point of life is to be something, to shed one's self-centeredness, to outmature an empty animal existence, and to attain to human life in all its goodness and glory, forever full and fresh. Thank you for listening.